The man who walked through locked doors. Some men become legends not because of what they did, but because of what others believed they could do. In the cotton fields of Georgia, people whispered about a man who moved through locked doors as if they were made of air. He walked past armed guards as if they could not see him. Dogs trained to kill never barked when he passed. Overseers with rifles never raised their guns. This was not magic. This was not folklore. This was something far more terrifying. It was power born from fear. From secrets so dark that even speaking them could destroy entire families. From a truth that chained powerful men tighter than iron ever could. His name was Thomas. And by the time you understand why no one stopped him, you will realize that some prisons have no walls, and some chains cannot be broken even by freedom itself. The first time anyone truly noticed Thomas was on a hot August night in 1857. Mrs. Elizabeth Hartley woke suddenly in her bed. She had not heard a noise at first. That was what terrified her most. Then she heard it. Her bedroom door closing. Not opening. Closing. Her eyes snapped open in the darkness. Her heart began pounding so hard she was sure it would wake the entire house. The plantation mansion was old and large, filled with the sounds of settling wood and distant insects. She tried to tell herself it was just the house breathing in the heat. But she knew better. There was someone in her room. Her husband Richard Hartley was away in Savannah on business. He had left days ago. The house had been locked tightly before bedtime. Every door bolted. Every window latched. 3 armed overseers patrolled the grounds all night with rifles. Dogs trained since puppyhood to tear apart any enslaved person found outside after dark circled the property. Those dogs had cost her husband hundreds of dollars each. Elizabeth lay frozen beneath her sheets as her eyes slowly adjusted to the moonlight. Pale silver light slipped through the edges of the curtains, just enough to reveal the shape at the foot of her bed. A man, standing perfectly still. Watching her. Her scream rose in her chest but never escaped. Terror crushed her voice before it reached her lips. Her hand trembled as she slowly reached toward the bell pull beside her bed. One pull and the house would fill with shouting men and gunfire. Her fingers were inches away when the shadow spoke. "No need for that, ma'am." The voice was calm, polite, respectful. That made it worse. Elizabeth swallowed hard. Her throat felt dry and tight. "Who are you?" she whispered. "What do you want?" "My name is Thomas, ma'am. I work your husband's fields." The man stepped slightly into the moonlight. He was black, tall, well-built, clean. His clothes were neat. Too neat for a field hand. His coat was well made. His boots polished. "I came to deliver something." He reached into his coat and removed a small leather-bound book. He placed it gently on her dresser as if it were something precious. "Mr. Hartley left this behind in town. At the Parker Hotel. He rented a room under another name. I thought you might want to see it before he returns from Savannah." Elizabeth stared at the book. Her mind struggled to understand what she was hearing. "How did you get in here?" she asked. "The doors are locked. The windows were shut." "Yes, ma'am," Thomas replied calmly. "I know. Then how?" "Sometimes doors open for people who know where the keys are kept. And sometimes the people who believe they own everything forget how much their servants truly see." He turned and placed his hand on the door. "Read the journal before your husband comes home, ma'am. All of it. Every page. You deserve to know the kind of man you married." With that he opened the door. The hinges made no sound. Someone had oiled them. Recently. Elizabeth listened as his footsteps moved down the hallway. Not toward the servant stairs but toward the grand staircase. The one reserved for family and guests. She heard the front door open softly. Then close. Silence returned. She sat motionless for several minutes. Then she forced herself out of bed and walked to the dresser. Her hands shook as she picked up the journal. The leather was expensive. Fine quality. She opened it by the window. The handwriting was unmistakable. Richards. The first entry was dated March 1845. Met with JH and FB today regarding the Georgia coastal venture. Initial investment required $15,000 per partner. Expected return 400% within 3 years. The risk is great, but the alternative is bankruptcy. God forgive us for what we are about to do. Elizabeth's breath caught. She turned the page. More names. More meetings. More money. Joshua Harper. Franklin Bradford. William Patterson. Judge Marcus Kent. The most powerful men in the county. Then the truth appeared. The Nightingale arrived last night near Brunswick. 247 souls aboard. 31 lost during the crossing. Survivors weak but sellable within weeks. Buyers waiting in Charleston and New Orleans. Expected profit $80,000. Elizabeth dropped the journal onto the bed. Her husband was a slave smuggler. Not a trader. A smuggler. Bringing human beings directly from Africa long after it was illegal. Long after the punishment became death by hanging. For years these men had broken the law together. Bribed officials. Bought silence. Built fortunes on blood. And Thomas knew everything. By morning Elizabeth understood something terrifying. Thomas was not free because he was invisible. He was free because no one dared stop him. Because the chains that held him were weaker than the secrets that held them. And that was only the beginning. If you want to know what Thomas does next and how these secrets begin to destroy the most powerful men in Georgia, make sure you subscribe to the channel. Share this story with someone who loves dark history. And leave a comment below telling me what you think Thomas really wants. Part 2 is coming. Part 2. The slave who owned his masters. Some secrets do not fade with time. They grow teeth. Elizabeth Hartley learned that truth the morning she realized her life was now balanced on the silence of one enslaved man. A man who could walk through locked doors. A man who owned her husband without ever lifting a hand. The journal lay closed on her lap as dawn broke across the Georgia fields. Pink light spread slowly over the cotton rows where enslaved men and women were already stepping out of their quarters. Some of them might have come across the ocean in chains. Some of them might have survived the same ships written about in Richard's careful handwriting. Elizabeth felt sick. The last entry burned in her mind. The venture concludes today. Richard had written those words as if ending a business deal, not a crime punishable by death. He believed the danger had passed. He was wrong. When the household woke, Elizabeth ordered every door and window checked. She watched as servants tested locks and bolts. Everything was secured. The night watchman reported nothing unusual. The dogs had barked briefly but then settled. There was no explanation. Thomas had been inside her bedroom. By the time Richard returned from Savannah 3 days later, Elizabeth had made a decision. She would not confront him with anger. She would confront him with truth. Richard arrived smiling, carrying silk fabric and gifts. He spoke of contracts and profits and future plans. Elizabeth smiled back, every word cutting deeper. That night, after their daughter was asleep and the house quiet, Elizabeth placed the journal on Richard's desk. He froze. The brandy slipped from his hand and spilled across the papers. "Where did you get that?" he whispered. "A man named Thomas brought it to me," Elizabeth said. "In our bedroom. While I was sleeping." Richard collapsed into his chair. "Thomas was standing at the foot of our bed, Richard," she continued. "He walked in and out of this house like he owned it." Richard buried his face in his hands. "I read it," Elizabeth said. "Every page. You smuggled human beings. You could hang for this." "I know," Richard said softly. "Then explain something to me," Elizabeth said. "How does a slave have this journal? And why is he still alive?" Richard looked up. Fear filled his eyes. "I cannot kill him," he said. "He has copies." Elizabeth felt the room spin. Copies hidden everywhere. If anything happens to him, those copies go to federal authorities. To northern newspapers. To the British Navy. Elizabeth sank into a chair. "How many people know about this?" she asked. 15 men, Richard replied. "All powerful. All guilty. And Thomas." "Why him?" Elizabeth asked. Why give him this power? Richard hesitated. Because we needed him. Thomas came over on the second voyage in 1845. He could read and write fluently. He kept records better than any white clerk I have ever known. An educated slave, Elizabeth said bitterly. Yes, Richard admitted. We thought we could control him. We were wrong. Elizabeth leaned forward. And now he walks into your house whenever he wants. 3 times a week, Richard said. He visits each of us. Walks through the front door. Stands there. Says nothing. Leaves. Just to remind you. Richard nodded. Elizabeth stood and walked to the window. There is more, she said. I can see it on your face. Richard was silent for a long time. Finally he spoke. The numbers in that journal are not complete. Elizabeth turned slowly. What do you mean? The journal shows 643 people smuggled. The real number was much higher. How much higher? She asked. I do not know, Richard said. Only Thomas knows. Elizabeth felt her breath catch. He kept 2 sets of books. One for us. One for the truth. The real truth. The ones who died at sea. The children separated from their mothers. The names erased forever. Richard's voice broke. He knows everything. Elizabeth understood then. Thomas did not just possess evidence. He possessed memory. And memory was power. The next afternoon Elizabeth saw Thomas for the first time in daylight. He was working in the fields, moving slowly, methodically. When he noticed her watching from the porch, he met her eyes. He did not bow. He did not look away. That night he came to the house. Elizabeth heard the front door open without a sound. She was waiting in the parlor when he stepped inside. Good evening, ma'am, Thomas said calmly. Why? Elizabeth asked. Why me? Because you are not blind, Thomas replied. And because you are not cruel. Elizabeth swallowed. What do you want? Nothing, Thomas said. I already have everything I need. You frighten them, Elizabeth said. Yes, ma'am, he replied. Fear is honest. She studied him. Do you enjoy this power? Thomas considered the question. I enjoy breathing, he said. I enjoy waking up alive. Everything else is necessity. Elizabeth felt shame burn inside her. What happens now? She asked. Thomas smiled slightly. Now the past remains buried. As long as I remain alive. And untouched. And if someone tries to stop you, then the past will rise. Elizabeth understood the truth then. Thomas was not free. But neither were they. He walked out through the front door, leaving Elizabeth alone with a terrible realization. The greatest prison on the plantation was not the slave quarters. It was the minds of the men who believed they were masters. If you want to know how long this fragile balance lasts and what happens when fear begins to crack, make sure you subscribe to the channel. Share this story with someone who loves dark history. And leave a comment below telling me whether you think Thomas is a villain or a hero. Part 3 is coming. Part 3. The weight of knowing. Power does not always come from strength. Sometimes it comes from knowledge. And sometimes knowledge becomes a curse so heavy that carrying it feels worse than chains. Elizabeth Hartley felt sick as Richard finished speaking. So those records are what he is holding over you, she said quietly. Yes, Richard replied. And they do not just prove smuggling. They prove murder, fraud, conspiracy. They name every official we bribed. Every law we broke. Every lie we told ourselves to sleep at night. Elizabeth folded her arms. If those records ever become public, she said slowly, this entire county will burn. Richard nodded. Judges, sheriffs, politicians, plantation owners. Anyone who profited or looked away. It will not be a scandal. It will be an execution of a whole way of life. Good, Elizabeth said coldly. You all deserve it. Richard flinched. Perhaps, he said. But think of what that means for you. For Sarah. Do you want her to grow up known as the daughter of a hanged criminal? Elizabeth closed her eyes. For the first time since reading the journal she felt trapped. Morality was simple. Consequences were not. What do we do? She asked. We do nothing, Richard said. We live with it. We wait. And we hope Thomas never decides to end us. Outside the window Elizabeth thought she saw movement near the trees. A figure. Or maybe just shadow. But she knew. Thomas was always watching. While the white families of the county lived in fear of Thomas, the truth was far crueler. Thomas lived in fear too. A deeper, quieter fear that no amount of leverage could erase. He belonged to William Patterson. Patterson was a man whose cruelty was legendary even among slave owners. He believed pain created profit. Whippings were routine. Food was withheld for minor mistakes. Humiliation was intentional. Thomas worked the cotton fields from dawn until dusk. His hands cracked and bled. His back screamed by nightfall. He lived in a leaking cabin and ate cornmeal and scraps like everyone else. In daylight he was invisible. At night he became something else. 3 times a week after the quarters were locked, Thomas washed his face and put on the coat hidden beneath his floorboard. A fine coat stolen years earlier by Ruth from Patterson's closet. He walked toward the big house calmly. The first time an overseer tried to stop him had been years ago. "Where you going?" Dutch had asked, rifle raised. "Mr. Patterson is expecting me," Thomas replied. "Before you shoot me," Thomas had said softly, "go ahead. See what happens next." Dutch never forgot the look in his eyes. Now no one stopped him. Thomas walked through the front door without knocking. Past the parlor. Past the dining room. Past children who pretended not to see him. In Patterson's study Thomas stood silently for exactly 60 seconds. He counted them in his head. Patterson never looked up. That was enough. Because fear does not need words. On his way back Thomas found Ruth sitting outside her cabin smoking her corncob pipe. "You took your walk?" she asked. "I did." Still shaking she said. "He is." Ruth exhaled smoke. "They will try to kill you one day," she said. "Fear turns desperate." "I know," Thomas replied. "Then why keep walking into their houses?" "Because fear fades," Thomas said. "And those walks remind them I exist." "And the real reason?" Ruth pressed. Thomas sat beside her. "Those 5 minutes are the only time I am not property," he said. "I need to remember what that feels like." "You could run," Ruth said. "Go north. Use what you know. And leave everyone else behind," Thomas asked. Ruth was quiet. That night Thomas wrote in his private journal. "Mrs. Hartley knows now." By 1859 Thomas had become a strange constant. Children grew up seeing him come and go. Fear became routine. Sarah Hartley was 17 that summer. She had known about Thomas her entire life but had never truly looked at him until one night she could not sleep. She went to the kitchen for water and heard voices from her father's study. One voice was her father's. The other was calm and commanding. She crept closer. "We cannot continue like this forever," Richard was saying. "I know," Thomas replied. "But forever is a long time. If the Union wins," Richard said, "you will be free. And if the Confederacy wins," Thomas replied, "my protection becomes priceless." "What do you want?" Richard asked. "Truly want." There was a pause. "I want justice," Thomas said. "Real justice. I want my daughter to grow up free." Sarah froze. "Daughter? You have a child?" Richard asked, shocked. "Born last month," Thomas said. "Her mother is enslaved. Like me." Sarah stepped back silently, her heart pounding. Everything she believed cracked open in that moment. Thomas was not just a ghost in their home. He was a father. And that made him dangerous in a way no ledger ever could. Because a man fighting for survival can be controlled. A man fighting for his child cannot. If you want to know what happens when Sarah's curiosity grows and how one secret changes everything, make sure you subscribe to the channel. Share this story with someone who loves dark history. And leave a comment below telling me what you think Thomas will do next. Part 4 is coming. Part 4. The Girl Who Listened at Doors. Some truths arrive quietly, not with screams or blood or gunfire, but with a single sentence that changes the shape of the world forever. "I want my daughter to grow up free." Those words followed Sarah Hartley back to her bedroom like a shadow. She lay awake in the heat, staring at the ceiling, listening to the slow ticking of the clock in the hallway. Her heart would not slow down. Thomas had a daughter. Until that moment, Thomas had been a mystery. A strange figure who walked into their house like a ghost. Someone her father feared but never explained. A slave who broke rules no one else dared question. But fathers were real. Fathers were human. And suddenly Thomas was no longer just a threat. He was a man with something to lose. The next morning Sarah watched Thomas from the upstairs window as he worked in the fields. The sun had barely risen, and already his shirt was dark with sweat. He moved steadily, never rushing, never slowing. He did not look up. She wondered where his daughter was. Somewhere in a cabin like the others. Somewhere fragile and new in a world that crushed fragile things without mercy. Sarah felt something unfamiliar tighten in her chest. That afternoon she asked her mother about Thomas. Elizabeth stiffened instantly. "Why do you ask?" she said carefully. "I heard him speaking with father last night," Sarah replied. "I did not mean to listen but I did." Elizabeth studied her daughter for a long moment. "What did you hear?" she asked. "Enough," Sarah said. "Enough to know that Thomas is dangerous because he is right." Elizabeth closed her eyes. That night Elizabeth finally told Sarah part of the truth. Not everything, but enough. She spoke of the journal. Of smuggling. Of crimes so great they could destroy families and fortunes. She spoke of fear and silence and how powerful men had trapped themselves. And she spoke of Thomas. "Your father and his friends believe they owned him," Elizabeth said. "But they gave him something far more dangerous than freedom. They gave him knowledge." Sarah listened without interrupting. "So he is holding them hostage," Sarah said quietly. "Yes," Elizabeth replied. Sarah nodded. Slowly. "They deserve it." Elizabeth said nothing. 3 nights later Sarah did something reckless. She waited. When the house was asleep and the air thick with summer heat, she slipped from her room and stood in the hallway. She listened. The front door opened. Soft, careful footsteps crossed the floor. Sarah's heart pounded as she stepped into the shadows near the staircase. Thomas passed beneath her without looking up. She followed. Not closely. Not foolishly. She moved like someone who had grown up in a house full of secrets. Outside the night air wrapped around her. She stayed far enough back to remain unseen as Thomas crossed the yard and headed toward the tree line instead of the quarters. That surprised her. She followed until he stopped near an old oak. "You can come out now," Thomas said calmly without turning around. Sarah froze. "I know when someone is following me," he continued. Slowly she stepped forward. "I am sorry," she said quickly. "I did not mean to spy." Thomas turned. In the moonlight his face was calm but tired. Deep lines marked his eyes. "You are Richard Harley's daughter," he said. "Yes," she replied. "You should go back," he said. "This is not a safe place for you." "I know about your daughter," Sarah said. Thomas stiffened. "She heard you speaking with my father." "Yes," Sarah said. "And I wanted you to know that I heard you. Not him. You." Silence stretched between them. "Why are you here?" Thomas asked. "Because," Sarah said slowly, "I think the world you live in is wrong. And I think you are the only person brave enough to challenge it." Thomas studied her. "Brave is not the word," he said. "Careful is." Sarah swallowed. "They are afraid of you," she said. "All of them." Thomas nodded. "Fear is useful," he said. "But it is also dangerous." "Why do you stay?" Sarah asked. "Why not run? Take your daughter and disappear." Thomas looked toward the distant cabins. "Because running saves one life," he said. "Staying might change many." Sarah felt a chill despite the heat. Before she could speak again, a voice called out from the darkness. "Sarah." Elizabeth stood at the edge of the yard, her face pale with terror. "Come back now," she said. Sarah hesitated. Thomas stepped back. "Go," he said quietly. "And do not follow me again." She obeyed. But something had changed. The next weeks were tense. Rumors spread through the county. Federal patrols along the coast. Northern newspapers sniffing around old shipping records. British ships spotted offshore. The conspirators grew nervous. William Patterson drank more. His temper worsened. Whippings increased. One afternoon Thomas collapsed in the field. Exhaustion, dehydration, or something worse. Patterson stood over him furious. "Get him up," he shouted. Thomas struggled to rise. Something snapped. That night Thomas did not come to the house. For the first time in years the visit did not happen. Fear rippled through the county like a sickness. The second night passed. Still nothing. On the third night Richard Hartley sent for him. He did not come. Elizabeth found Sarah pacing. "Something is wrong," Sarah said. Elizabeth knew it too. Before dawn a scream tore through the quarters. Thomas was gone. His cabin was empty. The floorboard lifted. The hiding place bare. Panic exploded. If Thomas had run, the records would surface. If he had been killed, the same. By sunrise riders were sent in every direction. Elizabeth stood at the window holding Sarah's hand. "Whatever happens next," Elizabeth whispered, "nothing will ever be the same. Because when fear loses its anchor it turns to madness. And madness always demands blood. If you want to know where Thomas went and what secret he left behind that could destroy them all, make sure you subscribe to the channel. Share this story with someone who loves dark history. And leave a comment below telling me whether you think Thomas escaped or planned something far worse. Part 5 is coming. Part 5, When the Ghost Disappeared. Fear is loud when it arrives. But it is far louder when it vanishes. The morning after Thomas disappeared, the county woke to panic dressed as order. Men rode out before sunrise. Horses thundered down dirt roads. Overseers barked commands they barely understood themselves. A ghost had slipped its chains. And no one knew whether it was running away or circling back to kill them. Elizabeth Hartley stood at the window watching riders cross the fields like ants scattered by fire. Her hands trembled as she held Sarah close. Neither of them spoke. They both understood what Thomas's disappearance meant. If he had fled, the records would surface. If he had been killed, the records would surface. If he was hiding, waiting, planning, then God help them all. Richard had not slept. He paced the house like a trapped animal. By noon he had sent messages to every conspirator. Emergency meetings were called. Men who had ruled the county for decades now whispered behind locked doors like frightened children. William Patterson arrived first. He looked worse than Elizabeth had ever seen him. His hands shook. His eyes were bloodshot. His clothes smelled of whiskey and sweat. "He's gone," Patterson said. "And the hiding place is empty." Richard swallowed. "Are you certain?" "I tore the cabin apart myself," Patterson snapped. "The floorboard is lifted. Whatever he kept there is gone." Elizabeth felt Sarah tense beside her. Joshua Harper arrived next. Then Judge Kent. Then 2 sheriffs who pretended not to be part of it, but everyone knew better. They gathered in Richard's study. No servants were allowed inside. "Thomas has not been seen," Harper said. "The patrols found no tracks. No signs of escape." "Which means," Patterson said slowly, "he did not flee in panic." Silence followed. "He planned this," Judge Kent said quietly. Elizabeth felt a chill crawl up her spine. Thomas had never acted without purpose. That afternoon a body was found. A young enslaved man from a nearby plantation. Beaten beyond recognition. Left in a ditch. The patrol brought the news like a gift. "This is him," one of the overseers said eagerly. "Must be." Elizabeth saw the relief wash over the men. But Patterson shook his head. "No," he said. "This is not Thomas." "How can you be sure?" Richard asked. "Because Thomas would never be caught like that," Patterson replied. "And because he would never die quietly." The body was buried by sundown. No prayers. No name. Thomas remained gone. That night Elizabeth could not sleep. She felt watched. Near midnight a stone struck the window softly. Once. Twice. Elizabeth's breath caught. She moved quietly and looked out. Nothing. Then she saw it. A folded piece of paper wedged beneath the sill. Her hands shook as she retrieved it. 3 words written in careful script. "Do not speak." Elizabeth pressed the paper to her chest. He was alive. The next morning the county woke to worse news. A packet had arrived at the Savannah Federal Office. Anonymous. Inside were copies of shipping records. Partial. Enough to raise questions. Enough to begin an investigation. Not everything. Just a taste. Harper burst into Richard's house screaming. "He's testing us," Harper shouted. "Seeing how we react." Judge Kent collapsed into a chair. "If the full records surface, we are finished." Elizabeth understood something then. Thomas was no longer defending himself. He was hunting. By evening soldiers arrived asking polite questions. Too polite. Their notebooks stayed open. Richard answered carefully. So did everyone else. But fear was leaking through the cracks. That night Thomas appeared again. Not at the big house. At the quarters. He moved silently from cabin to cabin whispering names. Ruth saw him. "First. You came back," she said calmly. "I never left," Thomas replied. Word spread quickly. He spoke to men and women who trusted him. Who had lost children. Who had scars older than memory. He told them nothing specific. Only this. Be ready. Before dawn Thomas reached Elizabeth's window again. This time he did not throw a stone. He knocked. Elizabeth opened the door. He stepped inside. Sarah woke and stood frozen in the doorway. "You should not be here," Elizabeth whispered. "I will not come again," Thomas said. "This is goodbye." Elizabeth's heart sank. "What are you going to do?" "What must be done," he replied. "The records," he said to Richard, who had entered the room, "are safe. But they will not remain hidden forever." "When?" "Soon." "Why warn us?" Elizabeth asked. "Because you listened," he said. "And because your daughter saw me as a man." Sarah stepped forward. "Will people die?" she asked quietly. Thomas met her gaze. "Some already have," he said. "Others will lose everything they value. That is the price of truth in a world built on lies." He turned to leave. "Thomas," Elizabeth said. He paused. "Whatever happens next," she said, "I want you to know that someone here believes you are right." Thomas nodded once. "That is enough," he said. By sunrise he was gone again. By sunset the county burned. Not with fire. With fear. Arrests began quietly. Accounts frozen. Names whispered in courtrooms far away. And somewhere beyond the fields Thomas watched. Waiting. Because horror does not always come screaming. Sometimes it comes holding a ledger. If you want to know how the first arrest changes everything and who betrays whom when survival is on the line, make sure you subscribe to the channel. Share this story with someone who loves dark history. And leave a comment below telling me whether you think Thomas will survive what he has started. Part 6 is coming. Part 6. When the First Man Fell. Every system built on lies survives the same way. By convincing everyone that collapse is impossible. Until the first man falls. The arrest happened just after sunrise. No warning. No ceremony. Federal marshals rode into the county as quietly as undertakers. They went straight to the home of Joshua Harper. By noon, everyone knew. Harper had been taken in irons. Men who had shared dinners with him now pretended they barely knew his name. Women shut their curtains. Children were pulled inside. The sound of hooves on dirt roads became a signal of terror. Elizabeth Hartley stood in her parlor holding a teacup she had not touched. Her hands were steady. Her heart was not. Richard sat across from her staring at nothing. "They have partial records," he said finally. "Enough to hang Harper. Enough to scare the rest of us into betraying one another." Elizabeth said nothing. She understood something Richard did not yet fully grasp. Thomas had designed this carefully. Harper was not the worst of them. He was not the most powerful. He was the weakest link. And once one man broke, the rest would follow. By evening Judge Kent sent word that he wanted a private meeting. No servants. No witnesses. They gathered again in Richard's study. The room smelled of fear and sweat. "Harper will talk," Patterson said bluntly. "He always was a coward." Judge Kent rubbed his temples. "If he talks, we are finished." "We need to control the narrative," Richard said. "Offer cooperation. Sacrifice 1 or 2 men to save the rest. Elizabeth felt her stomach turn. And who decides who is sacrificed, she asked. The men avoided her gaze. That night Sarah overheard raised voices again. Someone said Thomas's name. Someone said kill him. Sarah's blood ran cold. The next morning Thomas's daughter disappeared. Her mother was found screaming outside the quarters, clutching an empty blanket. Panic swept through the enslaved community. Rumors spread like wildfire. White men whispered one version. Black men whispered another. Elizabeth knew immediately. They were trying to bait him. That evening Thomas appeared in the open for the first time in weeks. He walked straight through the main road at dusk where everyone could see him. He did not hide. He did not hurry. Men froze as he passed. Thomas went to William Patterson's house. He kicked the door open. Patterson screamed. Neighbors heard the sound of breaking furniture. When Thomas emerged, his coat was torn. Blood stained his sleeve. Patterson lived. Barely. By nightfall Thomas's daughter was returned. No explanation. No apology. The message was clear. Thomas could still reach them. And now he was angry. Federal patrols increased. Ships were seized. Names surfaced in newspapers. Savannah, Charleston, Washington. The story spread. Illegal slave ships. Bribed officials. Southern elites exposed. The county became a place haunted by silence. Elizabeth noticed how servants flinched when white men approached now. How eyes followed Thomas with awe and fear. Power had shifted. But power always demands payment. One night Ruth did not come home. They found her body near the river. No marks. No wounds. Just gone. Thomas stood over her wrapped body and did not cry. Elizabeth watched from the porch, unable to look away. This is what they do when they cannot touch me, he said quietly. They punish the people around me. Elizabeth stepped forward. It has to end, she said. Thomas looked at her. It will, he replied. But not cleanly. That night Thomas made his decision. He sent the final package. Every copy. Every name. Every number. He sent them north. 2 abolitionists. 2 newspapers. 2 judges who still believed in law. He burned nothing. He hid nothing. He walked into the light. The next morning warrants flooded the county. Arrests followed. Patterson shot himself. Judge Kent fled and was caught at the border. Richard was summoned. Elizabeth held Sarah tightly. Whatever happens next, she whispered, remember who told the truth. Richard turned at the door. Thomas did this to us, he said bitterly. No, Elizabeth replied. You did it to yourselves. That afternoon Thomas surrendered. He walked into the federal camp calmly, holding his hands out. I will testify, he said. But my family walks free. The officer stared at him. You understand what this means? Thomas nodded. I have always understood. As they led him away, Sarah watched with tears in her eyes. He looked back once. And smiled. Because the most terrifying thing of all was this. Thomas was no longer afraid. If you want to know what happens when Thomas stands in court and speaks the truth out loud for the first time, make sure you subscribe to the channel. Share this story with someone who loves dark history. And leave a comment below telling me whether you think justice will finally be done. Part 7 is coming. Part 7. When the truth learns to speak. There is a moment when fear changes sides. It does not arrive with noise or violence. It arrives quietly, when the people who have always spoken realize that someone else has found his voice. That moment came when Thomas stood in a federal courtroom and raised his hand to swear an oath. The room was packed. White faces filled the benches. Reporters leaned forward with ink-stained fingers. Armed guards lined the walls. Outside, crowds gathered in silence, afraid to speak too loudly about what was happening inside. Elizabeth Hartley sat near the back, her face hidden beneath a simple bonnet. Sarah sat beside her, gripping her hand. At the front of the room stood Thomas. He wore no chains. That alone felt unreal. The judge asked his name. Thomas replied clearly. The judge asked his occupation. Thomas paused. I am enslaved, he said. But today I speak as a witness. A murmur moved through the room. Richard Hartley sat across the aisle. He looked smaller than Elizabeth remembered. His shoulders were slumped. His eyes never left the floor. When the questioning began, the horror did not come from what Thomas said. It came from how calmly he said it. He spoke of ships arriving under moonlight, of people packed below deck without air or water, of bodies thrown into the sea when sickness spread too fast. He named captains, dates, numbers. The courtroom grew silent except for the scratching of pens. He described bribes paid in gold and land, officials who smiled and signed false papers, sheriffs who looked the other way. Then he spoke of the children, the ones separated from their mothers, the ones sold under false names so no one could trace them, the ones who disappeared between ports and were never counted. Sarah buried her face against her mother. Elizabeth did not look away. This was the truth she had lived beside for years without seeing it fully. When Thomas finished, the judge removed his glasses and wiped his eyes. The defense tried to break him. They questioned his intelligence, his motives, his loyalty. You are lying for your freedom, one lawyer said. Thomas looked at him calmly. My freedom was never offered, he replied. Only survival. They accused him of manipulation. You threatened these men, they said. Thomas nodded. Yes. And why did you threaten them? Because they owned me, he said. And because they believed that made them untouchable. The courtroom held its breath. At the end of the day, indictments were read. Names Elizabeth had heard her entire life were spoken like curses. Joshua Harper, William Patterson, deceased by his own hand, Judge Marcus Kent, Richard Hartley. Elizabeth felt Richard flinch when his name was called. Sarah squeezed her hand. That night the county did not sleep. Fires burned late. Voices whispered. Some prayed. Some packed bags. Others sharpened knives. Thomas was returned to custody. For his protection, they said. Elizabeth knew better. Protection cuts both ways. 2 nights later a mob gathered. Men with covered faces. Quiet boots. Torches unlit. They came for the jail. Elizabeth heard the noise from her window and felt her blood run cold. Sarah woke screaming. They will kill him, she said. Elizabeth wrapped her in her arms. Not if the law holds, she whispered. But the law had never held for men like Thomas. Before the mob reached the door, soldiers stepped into the street. Federal troops. Rifles raised. The mob stopped. No one wanted to be the first to die for a lie already exposed. The men scattered into the dark. Thomas lived another night. In the weeks that followed, trials spread across states. Papers ran headlines. Politicians denied knowledge. Some fled. Some confessed. The South whispered about rebellion. About war. Change was coming. Violent change. One afternoon Elizabeth received a letter. Written in careful familiar script. Mrs. Hartley, it read. I do not know what the future holds. I know only that speaking the truth was necessary even if it costs me my life. If my daughter grows up free, then everything was worth it. Elizabeth pressed the letter to her chest. Sarah read it later with tears in her eyes. Will he be free, she asked. Elizabeth hesitated. I do not know, she replied. But he has already changed the world more than most free men ever will. The trial ended in chaos. Some men were sentenced. Others escaped justice. The system cracked but did not break. Thomas was not freed. The law did not know how to handle a man like him. He was returned to bondage under federal supervision. But something was different. He was untouchable now. Too visible. Too famous. He was sent north. Away from Georgia. Away from the people who hated him. Elizabeth watched the wagon leave town. Thomas sat inside holding a small bundle. A baby cried softly. His daughter. He did not look back. Because some men do not need to see what they leave behind. They carry it with them. That winter whispers of war filled every room. Fear returned. But it was no longer just fear of Thomas. It was fear of change. And change is the most terrifying force of all. If you want to know what happens to Thomas as the nation tears itself apart and whether freedom finally finds him in the chaos of war, make sure you subscribe to the channel. Share this story with someone who loves dark history. And leave a comment below telling me if you think truth can ever truly defeat power. Part 8 is coming. Part 8. When the world caught fire. History does not change politely. It does not knock on the door or ask permission. It breaks in screaming. The first cannon fired hundreds of miles away, but the sound reached Thomas anyway. War had come. By the spring of 1861, the nation was splitting open. States chose sides. Brothers argued. Neighbors stopped speaking. Fear returned, thicker and heavier than before. Thomas was taken north under guard to a labor camp near the border. Officially, he was property. Unofficially, he was a problem no one knew how to solve. Too dangerous to release. Too famous to kill. So they kept him working under watch, building roads and hauling supplies for a country that could not decide what he was. Free men stared at him like he was a ghost. Some whispered his name. Others spat when he passed. At night Thomas heard the screams. Not from pain. From memory. Men woke crying for families left behind. Soldiers dreamed of burning homes. The camp smelled of sweat, smoke, and fear. Thomas slept lightly, always listening. One evening a guard approached him quietly. "You should not be here much longer," the man said. "Things are changing." Thomas said nothing. He had heard promises before. Weeks passed. Battles were fought. Names of places reached the camp like curses. Fort Sumter, Bull Run, Shiloh. Each victory brought more death. Each loss brought more hatred. One night the camp commander was found dead. His throat cut. No one saw who did it. But eyes turned toward Thomas. He was locked in chains and thrown into a wooden shed. For 3 days no one spoke to him. On the 4th night a soldier opened the door. "You are being moved," he said. "Where?" Thomas asked. "Somewhere safer." They marched through the forest under moonlight. Halfway through, gunfire erupted. Men screamed. Horses panicked. In the chaos, hands grabbed Thomas. "Run!" a voice hissed. The chains fell away. Thomas ran. He ran until his lungs burned and the world blurred. When he collapsed, a woman stood over him holding a rifle. She wore a man's coat and blood-stained boots. "My name is Clara," she said. "And if you want to live, you will follow me." She was part of the Underground Railroad. The war had cracked open old paths and created new ones. Thomas moved from cellar to cellar, barn to barn, church to church. Everywhere he went people whispered his story. Some called him brave. Some called him cursed. He saw things along the way. Towns burned by their own neighbors. Bodies hanging from trees with no names. Children carrying rifles too large for their arms. The horror had spread. By winter Thomas reached a Union-controlled city. There he saw something that shook him. Black men wearing blue uniforms. Free, armed, standing tall. He watched them drill with pride and fear in their eyes. One of them recognized him. "You are the witness," he said quietly. Thomas nodded. The man saluted him. "Thank you," he said. For the first time since his capture, Thomas cried. Elizabeth Hartley followed the war through newspapers and letters. Richard was gone. Taken into custody, then released, then vanished. She sold the house. Moved north. Started teaching freed children to read. Sarah grew taller. Stronger. Quieter. One evening a knock came at their door. Elizabeth opened it and froze. Thomas stood there, thinner, scarred, older. Alive. Sarah ran into his arms. "You made it," she cried. Thomas smiled. "For now," he said. Freedom came in pieces. Not all at once. Not cleanly. The Emancipation Proclamation was read aloud months later. Some cheered. Some wept. Some laughed bitterly. Thomas listened silently. "Paper does not change hearts," he said. "But it opens doors." He joined the Union Army as a guide. He knew the land, the rivers, the hidden roads. He led men through darkness. Sometimes he led them into ambush. Sometimes he saved them. War does not ask which you prefer. One night his unit found a plantation burned to the ground. In the ashes they found chains melted together. Thomas stared at them for a long time. This is not justice, he said. This is fire answering fire. As the war dragged on, Thomas felt something growing inside him. Not hope, resolve. If he survived, he would tell everything. Every story, every name, so no one could pretend they did not know. The war was ending, but the horror was not. If you want to know what happens when the fighting stops and whether peace brings healing or a new kind of darkness, make sure you subscribe to the channel. Share this story with someone who loves real history. And leave a comment below telling me if you think freedom can truly exist after so much blood. Part 9 is coming. Part 9. Freedom's Shadow. Freedom did not arrive with trumpets. It came quietly, like a stranger standing in the doorway, unsure if it was truly welcome. The war was over. The guns were silent. The flags were raised. Newspapers called it victory. Politicians called it a new beginning. But for Thomas, freedom felt heavy. He stood in a small town square in the spring of 1865 as Union soldiers read the final orders. Slavery was over. The crowd reacted in waves. Some shouted with joy. Some stared in shock. Some turned away in anger. Thomas felt all of it at once. He was no longer owned. No longer property. No longer a shadow moving through locked doors. And yet, every eye that followed him carried a question. What now? He stayed with Elizabeth and Sarah for a time. Their home had become a place of learning. Freed men and women gathered there at night, sitting on benches and crates, learning letters that once were forbidden. Thomas taught when he could. Numbers, writing, truth. But whispers followed him. People remembered. They remembered the journal, the secrets, the men who had lost fortunes, power, and reputation because of words written by a man they once owned. Some of those men were dead. Some were ruined. Some were waiting. One evening, as Thomas walked home alone, footsteps followed him. He turned. 3 men stood in the street. Civilian coats. Military boots. You should have disappeared, one of them said. Thomas did not run. I did disappear, he replied. You just kept chasing. They left him with broken ribs and a warning. This war ended, but we did not lose. Elizabeth wanted him to leave. Go north. Go west. Go anywhere safer. Thomas shook his head. Running is what they expect, he said. I am done running. He began writing again. Not for leverage. For memory. Names. Dates. Places. Testimony from others who survived ships, plantations, prisons. He worked with abolitionists, journalists, ministers. Some stories were too horrible to print. Children thrown overboard to save food. Women sold under false names. Men worked to death then counted as missing. The nation wanted healing. Thomas brought truth. Many did not want to hear it. The Ku Klux Klan rose in whispers, then in fire. Night rides. Burned schools. Lynched teachers. Thomas attended a meeting where a preacher begged him to stop. You are reopening wounds, the man said. Thomas replied quietly. The wound never closed. Sarah grew into a young woman watching all of this. She learned strength from Thomas and compassion from her mother. One night she asked him, do you regret it? Regret what? The journal. The fight. Everything. Thomas thought carefully. I regret the lives lost, he said. I regret the pain. I regret the fear. But I do not regret the truth. Lies are the reason this happened in the first place. Threats increased. Letters arrived with no return address. We know where you sleep. Elizabeth found a symbol carved into their fence. Thomas moved out to protect them. He lived in churches, attics, safe houses. Freedom felt smaller than slavery sometimes. At least chains were honest. In 1868, Congress opened hearings into illegal slave trading and war crimes. Thomas was asked to testify. The room was packed. White men in suits. Black men in the back. Journalists waiting. When Thomas spoke, the room went silent. He named names. Captains. Judges. Merchants. Politicians. Some men left before he finished. Others stared at him with hatred that could burn skin. One man shouted liar. Thomas held up a worn notebook. This is the lie killer, he said. The hearings ended quietly. Some arrests were made. Most were not. America was tired of punishment. It wanted peace more than justice. After the hearing, Thomas collapsed. Years of fear finally caught him. Elizabeth held his hand as fever took him. You did enough, she whispered. Thomas smiled weakly. No, he said. I did what was required. He survived. Barely. When he recovered, he made one final decision. He would leave the country. Not in fear, in purpose. He traveled to England, where his testimony was welcomed. Where his records were preserved. Where historians listened. He lectured. He wrote. He warned. Across the ocean, America rebuilt itself with new laws and old hatred. Thomas never returned. Years later, Elizabeth received a letter. Inside was a single line. Truth does not die when we do. Elizabeth folded the letter and placed it beside the journal, now locked away in a university archive. The past was no longer hidden. But its shadow remained. If you want to know how this story finally ends and what legacy Thomas leaves behind in a nation struggling to remember, make sure you subscribe to the channel. Share this story so these voices are never lost. And leave a comment below with your thoughts on whether truth can ever truly set a nation free. Part 10 is next. Part 10. The Last Shadow. Some men are remembered not for what they did, but for what they left behind. Thomas had walked through locked doors, past armed guards, and into the homes of men who believed themselves untouchable. He had carried truth like a weapon, and the nation trembled as he spoke. But legends are never only about action. They are about fear, about the way others remember what cannot be undone. By 1870, Thomas had returned to America. Not to the cotton fields he had once walked, not to the homes of his former masters, but to a small town in the north where no one knew his name. He worked quietly as a teacher. He built schools. He helped freed families learn to read. And he lived with a shadow that followed him everywhere, the knowledge of every atrocity he had documented, every secret that could still topple lives. Letters continued to arrive, some kind, some threatening. Men and women who had survived the wreckage of the South wrote to ask for his guidance, for advice on navigating the new world that had been built on centuries of pain. Others reminded him that his enemies had not forgotten. The families of men he exposed wanted vengeance, and though decades had passed, memory is long and anger longer. One crisp autumn evening, a young man approached Thomas outside the schoolhouse. His hands shook as he handed Thomas a folded sheet of paper. Thomas recognized the handwriting immediately. It belonged to a man from Georgia, one of the few conspirators who had escaped trial and exile. You are not done yet, the letter said. You can never rest. Thomas read it, then folded it carefully and tucked it into his coat pocket. He did not fear the man. Fear had long since lost its grip on him. What he feared was indifference. That history would be forgotten, that the world would return to silence and pretend none of it had ever happened. The next day, Thomas walked to the river that ran through town. He looked at the water reflecting the golden red of falling leaves. He thought of the hundreds, perhaps thousands, who had died so that he could live. Who had never had a chance to tell their story. Who had been buried in silence. He understood then that his life would always be tied to the weight of memory. That evening, a group of townspeople came to his schoolhouse. Some were curious. Others were hostile. They had heard whispers of the man who had spoken truth to power, who had walked freely through homes of the guilty, and who had survived when he should have been killed. One woman stepped forward. Her voice was steady but low. Are you really Thomas, the man who carried the journals? Thomas nodded. Yes. The crowd grew silent. Some bowed their heads in awe. Others shifted uncomfortably, as if they could feel the weight of his history pressing down on them. One man, older and stout, spat on the ground. "You should have been hanged when we had the chance," he said. Thomas looked at him calmly. "And yet I am alive." The words were simple, but they carried all the power of the years behind them. By nightfall, the crowd dispersed. Thomas remained at the schoolhouse, writing letters and recording testimony from those who had survived the hidden horrors of slavery. He knew he could not save everyone, but he could make sure the world remembered. And then, in the quiet hours of the morning, Thomas walked outside one last time. His daughter, now a young woman, followed him silently. Together they stood on the hill overlooking the town. The sun rose, and the shadows of the past stretched long across the land. Thomas spoke to her softly. "Always remember," he said. "Never forget the lives that were stolen. Never forget the names of those who were lost. Never forget the power of truth, even when it terrifies." His daughter nodded, her eyes wide. "I will remember," she said. Thomas smiled faintly. "That is enough." He turned back to the town one last time. The streets were quiet. The houses stood like sentinels. The world had changed, but only just. There would always be injustice, always lies, always shadows. But there would also always be those who carry the truth, no matter the cost. And Thomas had done more than most could imagine. He had carried the weight of a century of horror, exposed the hidden crimes of men who thought themselves untouchable, and lived to see the world at least begin to reckon with what had been done. He walked back to his schoolhouse, took one final look at the river glinting in the morning sun, and sat down to write. Not for revenge, not for leverage, not for fear, but so the world could remember. His story would live on in the letters, the journals, the testimonies, and in the hearts of those he had touched. And in that way, he became more than a man. He became a shadow that could not be chained, a legend born not of magic, but of courage, patience, and the unyielding power of truth. Elizabeth and Sarah would continue to carry their own lives forward, shaped and strengthened by Thomas's actions. And somewhere, in a country still learning to be free, his daughter would continue his work, teaching children that courage is not the absence of fear but the ability to stand when the world demands silence. Some doors can be locked. Some chains can be hidden. Some horrors can be buried. But some men, and the truths they carry, are unstoppable. If you have followed Thomas's story from the cotton fields of Georgia to the halls of justice, share this story. Tell someone who needs to know that courage can come from the most unlikely places. Comment below with your thoughts on what freedom truly means. And subscribe to the channel to continue exploring stories of history that haunt us and teach us. This is the end of the story. But the shadow remains.